All right, let's get back into a really interesting journey today. At the outset, I want to say that I want to talk about MDMA at some point specifically. For this journey, I want to bring it up only to highlight one way that I have learned to incorporate MDMA into other journeys. So the journey I really want to talk about is a combination of things involving MDMA, mushroom, and DMT. So this is a 3-part layered medicine journey. And I like to bring this up because I have found it very useful, as I have learned from some knowledgeable people in the space, that MDMA is very effective to be used in combination with some other psychedelics, where it can sort of ease the transition into the entire journey process and remove a lot of the anxiety oftentimes, and enhance the journey in some other ways. So I know some people think that the combination of these things, like either just taking one psychedelic is far off and far out there for some people, and combining some of these things for other people would be an absolute no-go. And that's totally fine, and I agree with that, and I think you should do what you're comfortable with, and these things kind of take place over time. This really is not an endorsement of any particular method. I'm relaying my experiences, and for people to consume, understand, certainly question themselves. I will say that when used properly in proper dosages, the combination of certain psychedelics is certainly appropriate and can be done very safely. So this particular journey started with MDMA, and we can talk about those effects later, because MDMA really stands on its own and can really deserves its own time to discuss what it does. But so this journey though started with MDMA, and when I felt relaxed enough, I started with mushrooms. And the reason I did that again is because mushrooms, for me, as someone who's not an anxious person, I've never suffered from anxiety. I don't get anxiety from marijuana, but mushrooms, because they can be so strong, and in a lot of ways I say mushrooms really is at the top level of terms of potency and the type of journey and intensity of journeys and the things that happen, is up there with any and all psychedelics. So people that say, oh, mushrooms are not that potent, or is absolutely wrong. Mushrooms, I think, are at the top of the pyramid of psychedelic experiences in every way you could imagine. So because I felt comfortable and really safe, in large part induced by the MDMA, I felt really confident to go into the mushroom. And I'll say this, yes, the MDMA helps instill a feeling of calm and peace and love, and that plays a large part in the set and setting that you hear people talk about in setting up a journey to have the best experience you could. But the other part of that is sort of the placebo effect, where because I feel this confidence, because of the MDMA, that in and of itself produces a very strong input in terms of the set and setting, and really setting up the journey that was to come, which was the second leg of this 3-legged journey. So I got into these penis envy mushroom. The other thing I want to talk about a little bit is kind of like when marijuana started to become recreational and legalized across the country, and as growers started to develop multiple strains and with varying potency THC levels, the same is true about mushrooms. When you listen to old discussions, and like some of the old OG masters like Terence McKenna talk about the 5-gram hero journey, 5 grams is a lot of mushroom, really, no matter what strain you're taking. But today there are so many more strains available that if you compare gram to gram how much you're taking, you're really losing sight of the potency. Compare it again to a low-grade THC marijuana strain to something very high grade with a high percentage of delta-9 THC. So similarly, the psilocybin content of mushroom strains can really vary. So you really need to know as much as you can what you're taking. Very hard to measure psilocybin content, but if you have some education at least into what the particular strain is, you can start to at least take a more educated guess into what that dose is. When you're just dealing with a typical raw or dried, mushroom, you really don't know what's in a particular stem, what's in a particular cap, and they can vary. If you have an ounce of mushrooms, one stem and one cap can be different and can vary widely from another. So sometimes you just have to experiment, and when you have a batch, you'll know after experiencing it whether 1 gram, what that really does in comparison to other mushrooms that you may have had. This is just sort of an aside. But because I was feeling so confident, I got into these penis envy mushroom. Now, penis envies are smaller than the typical golden teachers that a lot of people are acquainted with, but they are nasty. And others that are really more educated in mycology can speak to this more intelligently than me. But oftentimes, a lot of these smaller mushrooms are more potent than the larger ones. And that may seem counterintuitive, but it is my experience, and I think that is fairly well received in the psychedelic community. But again, the variances are what they are. The issue is if you take a mushroom strain or that contains more psilocybin, and you took more, sometimes significantly more than you intended to, you're going to be okay. It may be really intense. That could really put you into a real serious journey, and that may not be the most pleasant thing as you get into it. But the reality is you're going to be fine. You will return, and all will be normal again, and you just maybe learn for the next time. But I was feeling confident. So here I go and digging into these really nasty blue, purplish penis envy mushrooms, and I probably had a few grams. And again, this is on top of the MDMA. In combination, this produced a really intense and different experience than I thought. And so we'll get into this. Mushrooms typically, for me, and that's who I can speak for, have a very natural feeling, the journey itself brings you more in tune with nature, and it feels like you are, becoming one with the nature source in a different way than if you were to take LSD or DMT, which while they can occur, naturally, that doesn't really happen. You really consume these, chemically now as compounds, DMT and LSD, and they typically produce more of in my experience, I get totally different visuals, totally different feeling and journey experiences. So the interesting part about this journey was that the intensity of the mushrooms, they were growing to the point that I was actually experiencing a very DMT-like journey, especially with the visuals. And while it was happening, I was surprised because they were eerily similar. That shouldn't necessarily be a surprise, especially when you look at the molecules. And I hope some people weigh in, again, chemists, mycologists, and people with a lot of experience who can really, speak to this. And I encourage you to look to other people for their input on these things as well. I never claim to be the authority on anything, and certainly not in these areas. What I am the authority on is my own personal experience. But I've had experience with both substances, and this was the first time that mushrooms produced a very DMT-like journey for me in terms of the visuals. A lot of times with DMT and like LSD, I see gears, rotating gears. I don't know why. It's very common and it happens to me often. And I was getting these gear-like, almost machine-like visuals and a connection as if these machines were alive. And the reason why it isn't surprising, though, is if you look at the DMT molecule and if you look at the mushroom molecule, the psilocybin molecule, they're very similar. Now, very slight differences in a molecule can produce extremely different effects. One can be totally safe and the other can be deadly, even though they're 99% alike. But the fact that if you look at them and pull it up and look at the molecules together, they are, similar. And so it may not be surprising that they can produce, on some occasions, some similar experiences. But rather than like the trees, like the nature kind of more natural effect that mushrooms generally produce for me, this experience was a little more machine-like, which is typical of LSD and dimethyltryptamine. It's just an observation. It was interesting. It sort of surprised me during the experience. But then something very mushroom happened, and that is that for the first time ever, and it's never happened to me since, that I was introduced to a essentially face-to-face encounter with the mantis. This is the praying mantis that you would, typically see. The mantis is very much alive in the mushroom encounter. If you do some research, you will see a lot of people talking about encounters with the mantis in psychedelic journeys, primarily with mushroom, but it can be produced with DMT also. And the mantis, I've heard in speaking with other people in the space that the mantis is making a comeback. For some reason, and I don't know why, it's becoming more prevalent in the journey experience for people. Maybe that has something to do with, it could be having to do with a lot of things, where the earth is going, something that's happening now. A lot of these things happen with timing. They're very cyclical, but I've heard people refer to our current time as the age of the mantis or the return of the mantis. There are some animals, some species of animals and beings that are related to psychedelic journeys. Like in ayahuasca, oftentimes people will see an owl, people will see a panther, certain animals that guide you through the journey, sometimes birds. So anything can really be experienced in a psychedelic journey. Some are more often associated with particular medicines, but anything can happen. Now, in this experience, I didn't have any communication with the mantis, which others really do report having some kind of communication or interaction. What I had was I was visually seeing the mantis, and the mantis was seeing me, but it was sort of doing its thing, and it was sort of like in a way that it was sort of large. So, like it was close to me, but big. And, it was doing its thing, just kind of like this, but not really at me. It was just there. It was noticing I was there, noticing that I was noticing it, and I didn't make any effort to do anything, right, or say anything or communicate. I was just noticing it, and it stayed like that for a little while, and I just kept admiring it and watching it sort of do its thing. That passed as the journey was starting to wind down. And I'll have to say here that I am now probably maybe 4 hours or more into this journey. So it's almost at the level of like the come down from everything, where the certainly over the peak. And because it had gone really well and I was still operating with this good experience and very positive, then I decided to get really ballsy. And while I was still under the effects of the medicines, I decided to go in for the DMT. So this is the trifecta. Now, this version of DMT was in a vape, and I got the DMT. I was, laid down, and then it was really hard to get it. First of all, as soon as I stood up, I'm trying to make my way, and you feel really woozy, really wobbly, because the psilocybin is, really still in the system. But I was able to navigate it, and I got to the DMT. I sit down, and I start to take some really big draws on the vape pen. Immediately, because DMT works so quickly, I was propelled into a place that I could only say was ancient Egypt. I have not yet been to Egypt, but I was in a desert over pyramids. So maybe it wasn't Egypt. It certainly felt that way to me. And I was like flying over the pyramids, but at the same time, I had a sense that this was a very, very long time ago, that I was existing in a time of antiquity. I've talked before about having this sense of time, about being in something, at a time that was ancient or very old, and having the sense that I have had relationships with people that go back millions of years. And that's a subjective feeling, obviously, but I've never had the feeling of something that ancient. I had that feeling again this time, that what I was seeing over the pyramids, like I was almost like flying over them, that it was an ancient time. I then took one more hit from the DMT pen, and something like almost like I was snapped out into a whole other dimension, and it really shook me. So I had all this confidence building up to it, but then you get to a certain point and that second hit of DMT, given everything else that was going on, really shook me because I was now somewhere else. And the only way I can describe this is that I felt like I was like out of the program, that I had this sense what I was looking at was like computer architecture, almost like grid-like visuals, that in a sense that everything I was seeing was computerized and orchestrated to have a human experience, and that it was computer made, and like that what I was seeing was a blueprint. And then something spoke to me and said, this is a blueprint of your life. And at that time I had a visual of like a rectangular shape with some triangles in it and circles in it, and I was told that this particular combination was my life experience. Well, I don't really know what else to say about that. I certainly was finished with the journey. I had a feeling in myself that what I have seen was so significant that I needed to just respect this. The journey was over. I had gotten everything out of the medicine that was intended for me for this time. And the rest of the journey, I was just relaxing. It was really in the middle of the night, maybe almost like morning now. And I remember just drifting off then eventually into a sleep. This experience and all that happened, but this was really chock full of a lot of different things that have only really created more questions. Now I hope to be able to have experiences in the future where I may be reintroduced to some of these things again, and maybe given an opportunity to further expand and learn from them some more, hopefully in a deeper manner, so that I can gain some further understanding into the things that I, have seen and experienced here. But that one was chock full, a lot of things going on, a combination of substances. So this was a really, really memorable journey for me, and I'm happy to share it with you. Take it easy.